and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your old beyond belief host, Madelyn.
I'm your, just physically old host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. This week, it's a side quest, and it's Emma's turn to pick our topic. So, Emma, this pre-holiday week, what are we going to be discussing on the show?
We're going to be talking about getting into games later in life, when you have not played games as a young person. Like how often, what goes into that, what obstacles you might face, etc., etc.
And there are a lot of obstacles. Spoiler.
Yeah.
So we talked on the podcast what feels like not that long ago, but it was probably over a year ago, about games that are good to play with, like, people of mixed levels. And I feel like this takes that and dives in even more to, okay, not just like I'm playing a game with someone who is not as gaming literate, but if you're just a person on your own, what does that take, and why is it such a daunting task?
Yeah. So this was sort of inspired I guess a couple of weeks ago now, there was this, like, interest article on Kotaku about a senior couple that was trying to play The Last of Us 2 and put up an ad on Craigslist for someone to come help them learn how to play the game after they really struggled with, like, even getting out of the first room of the game. It's a cute story, right? Like, it's wholesome. I enjoyed at the end where, like, the older man was like, I want to beat the youngins in video games and stand up against his fellow gamers, and then his wife looks at him and is like, what?
Yeah, he's ready to become a streamer. Yeah, it's really funny to think of him wanting to become a big name streamer when he's still like doesn't understand button prompts. But you know what? Yeah. There is a market for this kind of thing, so it's wild. I'm not sure I understand why they were like, yes, The Last of Us 2, that will be the game. And then when they couldn't get out of the first room, why they were still like, this is the game.
I don't know. It's a big game. They've heard of it, I guess. They saw high praise for it. The way you would make a decision about, like, a movie if you haven't watched a movie in a while, you know? You're like, oh, people like this. They also said in the article that they thought that if they could do The Last of Us 2, then they could do any game, basically.
Okay, so I see it from that perspective of, like, they're jumping in and they're going to figure it out and it's going to be a challenge on purpose. If it were me, I would just 100%. If I was in this situation and I struggled to get out that hard to get out of the first room, I'd be like, I don't think so. I think I'm done. I'm bad at this, so it's bad. And I'm done. Thus demonstrating that millennials do not have any resilience, and that these people aren't even boomers, right? They're the silent generation, or whatever the one before boomers are, that they have much more resilience than I do. Capital R.
I feel like it's also, like, when you, like, they're a husband and wife, right, who assumably like each other since they're still married in old age. So I think at that point, when you find something frustrating, as long as both of you are stupid, like, about it, like, not calling these people stupid, but, you know what I mean.
Oh, I do.
It's more fun.
We have been playing the same level on Super Monkey Ball for 3 days.
It's like that, except Ellie couldn't find her coat for a day and a half.
I think the slightly tilted level is harder than finding the coat.
For you.
You're right. No, I'm just kidding.
Difficulty is a subjective experience, Madelyn.
You're absolutely right. So, how did this inspire your topic?
Well, I saw some people talking on Twitter as well about this article, just talking about how games are just sort of by nature unfriendly to new players. That there's a certain level of understanding that most games expect players to have coming into them. For example, like the how to use a controller, basically. A lot of games are like, they know how to use a controller. I can put a triangle prompt on the screen and they'll understand that they need to press triangle to get something to happen. When, in the case of someone who's totally new to gaming, that might not be the case. And it's especially interesting in the case of The Last of Us 2, which, like, is rightfully praised for the amount of accessibility options it has, and in fact has a lot of accessibility options that would be useful to a new player if, you know, someone who was not a new player knew to turn those things on for the new player, you know? Like, when I played, I turned on directional assistance, right?
Yeah.
Where you press in on the analog stick and it will show an arrow showing the direction that you're supposed to go in. Because I have really bad directional awareness in general, but especially in video games. And I thought, wow, that will make the experience of playing so much smoother for me, because I don't have to run around in circles when I get stuck, because I'm really ignoring the obvious place I'm supposed to go. And that would be useful for a new player, but would you know that if you'd never played a video game before? Would you be like, yeah, that'll be useful to me? Well, so for all the accessibility it offers, it's still not necessarily accessible to new players.
Yeah, so it's beyond just a not having played a game and not being used to it kind of practice makes perfect paradigm, but it's like it's a language barrier and that sort of thing on top of that, and many, many other things that we could talk about today. It's like barriers on barriers on barriers, in ways that you just don't think about. I really have no memory of, like, learning to use a controller.
Yeah.
Nor do I remember that ever being something that the only, like, the baby version of this for me is when I, on occasion, have played on consoles that are not my usual. Namely, I know exactly what, I can, like, think about what a DualShock looks like, right? I know exactly what a PlayStation controller looks like. I know exactly what each button is. I don't have to think about it. On the Switch, I mostly know what the buttons are, although I have to think a little bit about what the triggers are and where like what's X and what's Y and what's A and what's B, right?
Yeah.
I've gotten better at that since having a Switch, but like Xbox,
yeah. And like the thing about that is like it's really just like two buttons switched.
Yeah.
And if you play PlayStation in Japan, circle and X are switched there.
Which is nutty. Yeah.
So the way it works here in the West and the way it works in Japan is different. And it's closer to the way, I guess, the Xbox is set up. But who knows? Who knows why that was done. I remember, like, falling off things a lot. Which maybe was because of my little hands,
Small hands, baby hands.
I still have baby gamer hands, but they are larger now. They are larger baby gamer hands.
Big baby gamer hands.
But I also do not really remember learning how a controller works at all. Just because I guess we just had a PlayStation in the house from pretty early on.
Well, for you especially.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's that. It's so wild to think about, like, having to learn that and not recognizing a button prompt when you see it. Like, it's one thing for me to have to look at a controller and be like, where's triangle when I see a triangle button prompt. It's another thing to not even recognize that that's what the game is asking you to do when you see the button.
In fairness, The Last of Us 2's button prompts are very small so that they don't, like, stick out, so they don't, like, take away from the realism of the game.
Of course.
So it's not like there's a literal picture of triangle. It's like a gray, tiny circle with a triangle inside of it. Yeah.
But there's a lot of interest groups to balance here, because at the same time, I get irritated with slow and boring tutorials sometimes, even though I recognize that they are useful and helpful for new players to the game. Um, like, I really don't need you to teach me how Kiryu punches again in Yakuza 6. Like, believe it or not, I do know how to do that now at this point, and like how to move. So like I catch myself getting irritated at these things, even though whatever, they don't take that long, and they're like probably super valuable to people who are new, you know, either to just like a game series, but particularly to people who are just new in general to games. But you have to strike a balance because people get annoyed by tutorials and mandatory tutorials.
I mean, you do want to think about your audience, too. Like, every Kingdom Hearts game, for instance, always starts with teaching you how to walk.
Yeah.
Which is just using the analog stick. And that's always funny when it's like, you know, you're in Kingdom Hearts 2, and like they're like, Roxas, come over here. And it's like, walk over to your friends. And you're like, okay. But those games are for kids, right? Like, one of their primary markets, especially the earlier ones, are children who maybe aren't super experienced on games and maybe would like a reminder that you use the analog stick to run. You know?
Yeah. But see, that's the trick, right? Because it's so hard to predict. You know, it's one thing if you're making a game that's geared toward children, right? But how do you know you're making a game that's geared toward older adults? Or even, that even has older adults as a substantial sub-audience, right? There seems to me, I mean, you posted all sorts of things, sorting all sorts of studies about, like, who plays games, right? But so many of those kind of top out at about, like, 65 or so.
Which does, I mean, that tells you a little bit about the game industry and the fact that they're not interested in catering to older generations, which, to be honest, doesn't make a lot of financial sense. I mean, old people generally have a good amount of disposable income on their hands.
It's like senior
citizens. So it feels like they should be trying to cater, but they just aren't interested in doing that.
They also have a lot of free time, theoretically, right? On just like that level, the level of having the disposable income and having the free time, you'd think that seniors would be a key games demographic. Especially now that there are starting to be people who are senior citizen aged who are old enough to have had experiences with games at younger ages, right? I totally get being a game designer in the early aughts, maybe, and being like, yeah, the old people just aren't going to get it, right? But now it's like, well, no, like, you have people who could have been young, who are seniors, could have been young adults, like, playing in arcades, right? So it'll be interesting to see if that pivots as, you know,
I mean, to me, it really feels like they're just like, well, they'll keep aging, and then we don't have to deal with it. Another 20 years, we won't have to worry about it, because everyone will have had some sort of gaming experience.
No. I think that's wrong. I think in the same way as all the developers got older, and they're like, crap, I'm a dad now. I have to make a dad game. I think we're going to see them keep aging, and be like, oh man, I'm a granddad now. I have to make a granddad game. I don't want the granddad game. Too bad. Yakuza 6.
No.
Prime example of a granddad game.
Oh no.
No, that's really where I think it's going. It's like, as soon as all these people, all these toxic, this is far away now, right? But as soon as all these toxic 30-somethings playing whatever Call of Duty. Oh no, they were like, it's the 40-something men that love Call of Duty, right? That was what the thing said. As those people age, there will be games for them.
Yeah, that's true.
But they won't need to be taught how to play those games. Well, they might if it's all VR at that point. But assuming that we're still in controller world or PC world for some of it, and the PC is never going to go away, they won't need to be taught in the same way. So it's not exactly the point that we're making here.
VR runs like on PC, right?
That's, true.
No, when the gaming world goes full VR, that is when I am expelled from the gaming world because of my vomit.
They'll figure out how
I
to
will
cater to
expel
you.
the vomit, and at the same time, the gaming community will say, "You're done playing games." Sorry for your motion sickness.
But anyway, the point being, I think that the games industry will realize there are older people, maybe in about a decade, as they get older. But I don't think that that will lead necessarily to solving the problem that we're talking about today. That's an aging population of people who are into games. Those people exist now in the older community, right? One of the studies said like something like between 20 to 25% of seniors, I can't remember exact, boomers actually, not seniors, boomers, have played games for more than 25 years. So that makes sense, right? If you think about that, that's not that surprising. But also, that's only 25%. That will probably be much higher the next generation to hit that age marker.
Yeah. Anyway, video games should be taught in schools.
Genuinely. I was thinking about this. You brought up the Wii, obviously, in here. The Wii as one of our major examples of something that has broken through across age barriers. Not that I don't have any specific statistics on like how many people own the Wii, but of course the perception of the Wii is that people who were not normal gamers were playing the Wii, right?
Yeah.
Which must have been true to some extent. But so much of that is built on stuff that you learn how to do not in games, right? So it's like Wii Sports or Wii Fit, right? Are all things that you learn in gym class. And yeah, you don't learn them with the Wiimote, but you learn them in gym class or you watch them watching sports on TV, and it ties into other things that you like are taught in school. So yeah, where's my games class?
I mean, the actual problem with teaching games in school is that it's expensive, right?
Well, yeah.
Unlike, reading a book or even watching a movie, which, to be honest, I just think that, like, English classes in schools should probably teach a wider variety of things than just books, especially now that there's so much media and different things are read in different ways, right? That it would probably be helpful for people to learn how to parse those things at younger ages. But yeah, the real issue with games, as opposed to, like, books or movies, is theoretically you could tell someone, like, okay, to read this book at home or watch this movie at home, and it would be feasible for the school to have some sort of copy that a student who didn't have the resources to get that for themselves could watch. But with a game, to play any of like the big budget games, you either need a console or a relatively good PC. And while some schools do provide laptops to their students now, they're not exactly gaming PCs. I do think it would be interesting to have a class where you play a game in class, and like every half hour, like, you switch out who's playing it, and then you have, like, talks about the game as you're playing it in the class, for instance. That
Let's
could be a
Play
workaround.
101. Fox News would love that.
Yeah.
I do wonder, though, I totally agree that if you're thinking about what it costs to run a high school English class, games are not feasible. But when you think about what a college textbook costs, like...
Sure, yeah.
It becomes
but then again, the college doesn't subsidize that for you.
No, true. But the point being, I had never thought about this before because my textbooks were plays, so they never cost that much. But when you think about like the outrageous prices of college textbooks, in that sphere, it seems much less unreasonable, minus the impossibility of getting like a PS5, right? But it seems much less unreasonable to have a campus stock of like base PS4s that you have to buy that, and then you get like library copies of the games.
The issue with doing that in college is once you're in college, you're taking specialized courses. So you take a games course because you're interested in games already, right? So at that point, if you're not interested in games, you're probably not, or haven't had any experience with games, you're probably not taking those classes.
Yeah, no, that's true. I guess if you were doing, like, if you're at some kind of, like, very hippy-dippy liberal arts school, you could make it part of the core curriculum. But you're right, that won't capture everyone in the same way as having it as, like, a middle school class or something like that would. And it certainly doesn't resolve the issue of games literacy also featuring kind of a silent class divide.
Yeah.
So it's not a perfect thing, but it's just something I hadn't thought about before as even like, oh yeah, maybe that's not totally unreasonably expensive for a college like English equivalent course, because probably the English textbook costs almost as much as an old used console anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I had to buy games for some of my classes, but I mean, I have stuff that I can play games on, so.
Well, you then hit the barrier of people's internet access as well, because of course having a disc isn't enough to play the game ever. So
yeah.
I'm not saying that this solves the issue, but it was just something I had never thought about before.
Yeah. I mean, it's just taken for granted that you have a ton of English classes that teach you how to read a book, you know?
Yeah.
Not just how to read. And I'm not saying that's bad, right?
Yeah. Emma's coming
a lot
out
of gamers
anti-English
could take
class.
A lot of gamers could re-up their English lit skills, yeah. But it's interesting that, like, we haven't expanded that really to anything else. We're like, we teach books. The rest of it, I guess, you can figure out on your own.
You do a little bit, usually, of, like, film analysis compared to a book. Sometimes.
Yeah.
A tiny bit of that.
But even that, I feel like, teaches people to
I
read movies and TV and games with the same set of skills as books, which is not always right.
We watched like Life of Brian in Latin class. That seems like film studies, basically.
All right. If you took Latin class, you're set.
Just saying.
But there's even stuff that's, like, established in games to be, like, helpful or is just, like, expected. There was this one Quora that was like, is there such a thing as gaming literacy, and what are the things you need to be considered gaming literate? And the answer was talking about how, like, there's all these, like, concepts that have evolved in games over the time, like the 3D camera, and, like, when you're Mario and, like, you look in a mirror, you can see, like, the guy with the camera behind you, like, on a cloud, like, holding the third-person camera.
It's incredible.
And that was so funny to me, because now it's just like, yeah, the camera's there, you know?
Yeah.
There's the guy on the cloud behind you with the camera.
We didn't talk about Kane and Lynch. That is basically Kane and Lynch.
Yeah, exactly like that. But that's just something where people are like, oh yeah, the camera's there, and that makes sense to what I'm playing, but might feel odd to someone else. You know, just stuff like that. Or, like, the way that yellow stuff is, like, stuff you can climb, or the way you would mark climbing stuff with colors so that you'd find it. But if you didn't know that, you might still be trying to climb, you know, random stuff.
Or something you posted talked about, like, how games almost always, like, side-scrollers almost always go from left to right. Right? Just, like, all sorts of things that are just like, oh yeah, like, I know this about the game. That you wouldn't know unless you had that kind of, like, genre literacy, almost.
I mean, the keys of this thing, of course, is that, like, these systems are there so that once you learn it, like, you understand it, right? Like, once you're like, okay, this generally goes from left to right, you get that, right? It makes sense to you. Or, like, climbable things are marked somehow so that I know what it is. Once you've learned that, you get it. But you do have to learn that first. And games don't always tell you that straight out. So it's sometimes a lot of trial and error. It's like Dark Souls, except basic game mechanics.
Yeah. And that's not to say, the point of using these kinds of shorthands and understood conventions is to avoid having to tutorialize every little thing for your player, right? The point of just, putting colored markers on the wall, or the point of making your jump button like the triangle button, or whatever. That's probably less the case these days. The point of left analog stick move, right analog stick camera is you don't have to explain that to your player. Your player probably knows that already. And so you don't have to waste a lot of time on menus that pull them out of the gameplay experience. However, that just makes it double alienating for someone who doesn't have that experience. And that's not to say, there are things that are somewhat equivalent to this in any genre or piece of medium, right? We recognize that we can check our phones during the title sequence of a television show, right? Because it's going to be the same, probably. Or we recognize that, using the first person in a story, right, refers to the character. Or we recognize, there's any number of things that we can point out that are used as shorthand. But of course, the difference in games is that it becomes a barrier in a way that, you just don't see in other things beyond, maybe you could talk about, barriers to experiencing, Shakespeare or opera, or, something that's, very, very kind of removed from the everyday person's experience. And even those, you can still experience more of them and get more out of them than you can if you can't figure out what the jump button is in a game.
So unfortunately, the sort of conclusion of how do you get into games if you've never gotten into them before is either have a lot of patience, have someone in your life who will teach you, who also has a lot of patience.
Probably even more so.
Or put an ad on Craigslist.
Hire a tutor.
But that doesn't to say that there aren't, games you can start with if you're looking for games. Although I found some of the lists we found
bad,
interesting.
Well, it's just I feel like the lists that are out there for good games for beginners are good games to convince someone who is watching you play a game that games are worthwhile.
Yeah.
Which is in itself, getting someone even interested in playing a video game is sort of the step zero of this. But, to be honest, that's something that the culture is sort of already doing for you, right? Games are more and more and more and more front and center of cultural coverage. And, while you could go out of your way to try to bond with someone by convincing them that games are worthwhile by playing a game in front of them, those games do not necessarily 100% overlap, and I don't think they overlap even the majority of the time with games that make sense for a baby's first game.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I'm sort of two minds about this. Going back to the couple playing Last of Us Part 2, in a way I'm no, that shouldn't be your first game, Yeah. There's, multiple sort of combat systems going on. You've got, weapon upgrades, it's very realistic, so there's less indications of where you're supposed to go. Sometimes you ride a horse,
Yeah.
You have to know, when to sneak versus when to just run away. And at the same time, I'm maybe, in some ways, this is a good one to get them started, because it really is interested in, film, in being sort of, the language of film and using it to tell a more cinematic story. So in that way, it's a game that is more familiar to someone who has never played a game in terms of following what's going on, I guess.
You say that, but they expressed confusion about when was the game and when was a cutscene. So...
Yes, I didn't really mean it in that sense. I meant it more in you know, it's familiar. If you like TV shows, you're like, oh, this is sort of like an HBO TV show coming soon.
Right.
Starring Pedro Pascal.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant by familiar. But yes, there is the issue of when is it a cutscene versus when is it gameplay. The smooth transitioning from gameplay to cutscene, really coming back to bite everyone who's like, dang, that's so cool that there's no cut in between.
Yeah.
Someone playing God of War and being like, when is it my
when is it my turn? But see, that's why I think, you know, obviously the gateway to convincing someone to want to play is watching a playthrough, whether that's live on your couch or through a Let's Play type thing online. But I just don't think, and I do wonder if this is why, like, every single article about games and seniors is like, games are great to keep you mentally sharp. Games are great for socialization. None of them are like, games are fun.
Yeah.
Which is, like, so interesting to me because, like, can you imagine if, like, the main marketing technique for The Last of Us Part 2 was like, this is going to keep you mentally sharp.
It'd be very funny.
For everyone. It's like, no. But I totally get it, because if you're expecting that, like, the best these people are going to be able to do is play, like, Tetris and, like, online Scrabble and maybe some light Animal Crossing, then, yeah, like, you don't want to sell them as fun, because that's, like, not that fun. I mean, it's fine. I not to hate on any of those games. I just mean, yeah, if you're treating it as, like, exercise, then maybe you're, like, priming people to expect it to be difficult and expect to have to practice. And in some ways that's a good thing, but eventually you have to start, like, transitioning to, also there are fun things to engage with here, not just it's all exercise. I
mean, on that, I pulled the age demographics of the Switch from the presentation, their budget report from, like, earlier, that they released, like, a week ago or something. Mm-hmm. And first of all, every 22-year-old owns a Switch.
Every single one.
Every single one in the world. It doesn't go above 60. And there's definitely a steady decline from 22-year-olds. Except for, like, the 32-year-olds who have a little blip upwards in comparison to their surroundings. But they also have, like, I assume those games are meant to correlate to, like, what games the age group is playing most, like, down at the bottom, unless they're just decorative, but they sort of make sense, except for the 7-year-olds playing Breath of the Wild, which doesn't make sense to me very much.
That smells to me like that 7-year-old gets to play Dad's File every once in a while and just, like, run around.
But the older ages have, one, I think it's so funny how Pokemon is, like, 30-year-olds.
Yeah.
That's a side note, though. But the older generations have Ring Fit Adventure and then Animal Crossing, which I think sort of speaks to that, like, treating as exercise versus saying there's, like, fun things to do in it, right? Because Ring Fit is just sort of the evolution of Wii Sports, right? Except with a little bit
kind
more.
Of. It's like Wii Fit meets Wii Sports. Yeah.
Yeah. But then Animal Crossing is just a game where there's not really any stakes to it, right? Like, even something like Stardew Valley has, like, more pressure on you to, like, get things done, I guess.
Some of that comes from the experience of being a gamer, but yes, the fact that time actually clips forward in a way that kind of matters and you can be punished for, yeah.
Yeah, it's not real-time based, right? Like, a day is shorter than a day.
No.
Which does make it feel a little bit more frantic. But Animal Crossing is just like, you pop in, you know, you can do a few things if you're playing it healthfully.
Right.
And there's not, like, you can't really get a fail state in Animal Crossing in any meaningful way. And that's popular with older people. Which I also read some things of, like, the people, like, anecdotally, like, grandparents playing with their grandkids in Animal Crossing during, like, the pandemic,
Right.
basically. And so, yeah, Nintendo's just good, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It's sort of making some experiences that are grandparent friendly, I guess.
Totally. I do think the grandparents of the world are at a bit of a disadvantage compared to the grandparents of perhaps the aughts or earlier, in that you're jumping in at like games 3 or 4 here now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I was thinking as we were preparing for this, I was like, how did anyone ever learn how to play a game? Like, eventually there was like a generation where most people had never played a game before, and like, how did any of them learn? But of course, the kind of games you're learning to play in an arcade are like, there's one joystick and you might have 2 buttons.
Yeah.
And for the most part, it's like relatively straightforward. And now it's like years and years and years of iteration on top of that, that it's just like much, much harder to start now than it would have been if your first game was going to be Galaga with a bunch of your friends, including your best friend who's spent $100 there this month on Galaga to tell you all the tricks.
Yeah. And can you imagine playing like a JRPG as your first game? I can barely navigate menus in JRPGs, let alone keep track of like what all my different points do.
Well, it has to kind of not matter, right? Like Kingdom Hearts is a JRPG. I know it's
That's not the one I'm talking about. That's not the kind I'm talking about. Yeah.
I know. I'm just saying, like, I'm thinking of that game in particular. I'm thinking of that game as like, okay, that is one of the first games that I remember playing, right? And granted, I'm sure that Dad did a lot of playing it behind the scenes. But that was a game where there is a bunch of stuff that you can kind of do in terms of like light min-maxing your stats and your abilities and like the magic shortcuts and types of magic you use. Like, I never used a freaking summon until I was an adult, right?
Yeah. But
you can play without that and still get the experience. And that's definitely not true. Like, definitely there's like a JRPG time where you could jump on board, I feel like, when everybody loved the original Final Fantasy VII, where the kinds of people who played games probably also had experience with tabletop. And so we're familiar from that. But that's definitely not. Now that games are so much broader, and those kinds of big JRPGs are targeted much more broadly, especially in the West, that's definitely not the primary demographic anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, Kingdom Hearts is really interesting in that, especially if you're playing on one of the lower difficulties, like, it has a bunch of stuff you can use, and it does, have those critical modes, where you can really challenge yourself if you want, but, like, you know, you can just sort of ignore most of the systems, especially, I think, in, you know, like 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Sort of ones. Like, 2 has all those drive forms, but I don't remember using drive forms very much on, like, when I was playing on the PS2 and I got stuck on Demix for so long. How did I have the patience for that? That's one of my questions.
Well, how did anyone have the patience pre-skipping cutscenes, right? But
how did I watch cutscenes over and over and over again? I was such a patient child, apparently.
Apparently. You've been trained to, because the game trained you. You didn't know you could do any different. You didn't know any different.
I guess so.
So, the trick, though, of course, is it's very difficult to balance a game where it's like, I'm going to build all of these fun and engaging systems for experienced players, but they're totally optional. Like, I respect the incredible challenge of that from the development standpoint, because I just don't know how you would go about doing that. And obviously that's one way to make your game friendlier to new players, is like, you can play it on simple mode. But if those systems are going to be integrated into your game in a way that feels like actually good, like, you kind of can't do that. It's the whole Dark Souls difficulty conversation all over again, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is a shame to me that like that is the only like accessibility conversations in games must only be arguing about difficulty modes or look, we have colorblind mode and nothing in between.
Yeah.
Because it definitely does a disservice to these kinds of gamers who it's like, you know, the 70-year-old who wants to play a game isn't like differently abled or in need of like formal accessibility from like a...
Well, they might be.
Well, okay, fair.
Just because...
Sorry. You're right. There's lots of intersecting things here. But I've created a fully healthy 20/20 vision, never wore braces, muscly 70-year-old who no arthritis, like
a Chad grandpa, I'm saying.
Yes, I've created Chad grandpa here, and Chad grandpa wants to play the game, but he has, you know, it's not like capital A accessibility like, you know, you think of for managing people with like different physical needs. And it because that has kind of like dominated the conversation, the only conversation around people engaging with the game at different experience levels is always just no easy mode, get good.
Yeah.
Although there's a notable lack of that in comments about wholesome grandparent game stories.
Yeah, that's true.
Nobody is like, get good, Granny.
Somebody out there is.
Well, yeah.
There's someone in the world who's saying that.
Fair enough.
I did think it would have been interesting, and obviously this isn't something that every game can integrate. But, I mean, if you're getting into games, like, on your own, you're probably looking at the AAA releases anyway, just because that's what you are most likely to have heard of, right? Not, like, the indie game that just came out the other week.
Right.
To know about indie games is like already a level of gaming literacy to understand the difference.
Definitely.
But like, it would have been interesting for The Last of Us 2, especially with how dedicated it is to accessibility on all other levels, if like you had booted it up and it had been like, are you a new to video games? You know? And you can, like, toggle that on, and that, like, gives you more tutorialization, I guess.
Yeah.
Obviously, I haven't thought into how this would actually be integrated. But I remember being, like, when you boot it up for the first time now, it asks, it has text-to-speech on. It asks you if you would like to keep text-to-speech on, right?
Yeah.
And so it'd be interesting if it had that, and then it was like, well, are you new to video games, and would you like additional help when starting out in this game? Because that feels like something that, like, premier PlayStation studio, like, the reason The Last of Us Part 2 is able to have all those accessibility options is because it's a premier PlayStation studio that has the budget and the money and the time. I mean, they could have used more time. But whatever. This isn't about crunch right now. But, and because PlayStation wants their, you know, first-party titles to be an option for the widest variety of players, because theoretically those things can sell consoles, right?
Yep.
So they're trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience. So it'd be interesting for them to try something like that out in the name of broadening their audience even further.
Well, I think it could be interesting for them in the same way. Now, I've never played. Have you played Astro's Playroom? Does that come on your PS5?
Yeah, I played a little bit. Yeah.
So, that's not like a learn to game thing, though, is it? It's just like
no, that's just showing off the controller.
Cool. Yeah. So it feels like whatever. Make Asobi do it, since that's apparently all they're allowed to do anymore. But like, have the console come loaded with a game that's like a learn to game.
That'd be cool too, yeah.
Right? It's like, you've bought the console, this is going to walk you through, like, here's what the analog stick is, here's how it's often used. Like, they could even do, like, little snippets. You could use it as a marketing thing, right? You can do little snippets of, like, here, we're going to play this 10-minute section of The Last of Us, and we're going to explain to you how it works. And here, we're going to play this 10-minute section of God of War, and we're going to explain to you how it works. And here's 10 minutes of Final Fantasy VII, and we're going to explain to you how it works. I mean, you could have like you could have like a base Astro's game room. I know this is my spinoff. I know it's called Astro's Playroom. Where there's like, you're learning some basics in like a training. It's the game gym. But I think there are cool opportunities to jump into actual games and sort of show how those are implemented. And obviously, of course, different games have different things, and that's hard, but just like having something that teaches someone like, this is a hit point bar. You often see it in this kind of game. Like, this is often the jump button. Here's how jumping and double jumping works, right? Here's a simple inventory system. Even laying the groundwork of these are things that exist in games that you might have to think about feels like it could go a long way. And take some of the burden off of developers of that system to have to include, like... I mean, I don't know. I realize that this is, like, me creating the analog of, like, Xbox just released something that can, like, color correct games for color blindness. And I don't want to take all of the onus off of directors to explain this to new players, because of course there will be unique things about each game. Mm-hmm. But I'm intrigued by this. I'm intrigued by the idea of like a short game training game that's still fun, but that would like teach people a little bit about how to game. This is a cutscene. Don't press any buttons.
Yeah. That would be cool.
Or just make everyone who buys a console take a, 3-credit course on gaming.
Should do that, too. I don't know. I was reminded when I was saying that about the text-to-speech of, like checking in on people, starting The Last of Us 2 for the first time, because I was curious. And, the dichotomy of people that was like, yes, they have text-to-speech so that people who are vision impaired or blind can play the game, and people who, the text-to-speech came up and they went, whoa, who would want that?
Oh my god.
Two types of people in the world.
Big yikes. I do also think that the decline of the physical game guide puts the new gamers in the world at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
That's probably less the case for 30-somethings who didn't grow up in an economic situation to play games, as opposed to seniors who may not be as comfortable with technology in general, but... Because, I believe someone who is, younger can use the internet and can look up a walkthrough. That, of course, is much more of a barrier to someone who it's ooh, we're worried about them feeling comfortable with technology at all. Not just a game console. But, overall, it seems to me if you want to make your game friendly, the friendliest games for someone to start off with this holiday season as you're thinking about buying a PlayStation 5 for your great-grandma, is something that doesn't have too much time pressure to it, something that doesn't have too much fail state to it, something that at least has a tutorial, and probably something that you've played before.
Yeah.
Maybe
yeah,
not.
Don't give your grandma a game you've never played before. I don't know, that seems like a bad idea.
At least get it for both of you at the same time.
For, various reasons. Not just, teaching it. Just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Seems like a bad idea.
Grandma, tell me how was Deathloop? To review it for me.
Oh my god. No, just get them Animal Crossing. Seems to be the main takeaway I've gotten from this, is Animal Crossing works.
Skyrim grandma's gateway drug was Civilization.
That's so weird to me.
Civilization is so complicated.
There's so much going on in Civilization that it's very weird that would be someone's entry into games.
On their own, too.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of systems in Civilization that even I, as someone who has played it for years, don't engage with.
Yeah.
But
just really throw them in the deep end. Get them one of the Crusader Kings. Say good luck.
Good luck. Have fun.
Does have a tutorial, so that's one box
That's
checked
all
off.
you need.
Yeah.
Well, Emma, any closing thoughts?
No, not really. I feel like we covered pretty much everything I was thinking about this topic. I was watching some of this series, YouTube series from Rasputin on YouTube that's like gaming for a non-gamer. He has a bunch of videos on that with his wife learning to play video games and him talking about the experience, which did remind me a little bit of Clickbait Boyfriend, but like more extreme.
Yeah.
And they're just like very, like, it's a very funny concept. He was like, so I started her on a lot of games and then refused to give her any help for the purposes of this informal experiment. And I was like, I can't believe she didn't leave you. Anyway, the main takeaway was, don't do that. This isn't the best way to teach games.
Believe it or not, to teach games, maybe it's helpful to have a teacher.
Yeah.
And apparently Reddit is ready to deliver.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, did you or anyone you know come to gaming later in life? Or do you remember what it was like as a child, learning how to game, since Emma and I learned at such a formative age that apparently it's just baked into our souls? Do you have thoughts on what games might be easiest or hardest to teach? Do you think that cameras are the one thing standing between people being able to play games? That's what Clickbait Boyfriend said to me. He was like, I see it with you when you play first-person shooters. You don't know how to move the camera. And I was like, okay.
This is true.
Like, fair enough, but rude of you to say. If you have thoughts on any of that or anything else we talked about this episode, hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games that are in the hat for our main editions, and read our blog, featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, which is not a non-gamer playing a game, but it's a non-Kingdom Hearts player playing Kingdom Hearts, and Split Screen, where Emma and I watch My Hero Academia, and previously Coffee Prince, now Crash Landing on You.
Coming soon.
Very exciting. Most importantly, though, if you enjoy the show, give yourself the gift this holiday season of subscribing. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, everywhere that you can find podcasts, basically, probably, you can find Talk This.
Yeah.
So next week, when you're in your post-Thanksgiving eating pie for the 4th day in a row haze, we'll be back with a main edition that is Banjo-Kazooie and some other game that I thought to myself, I'm not going to play that.
Guilty Gear.
Guilty Gear. Great. So look forward to my review of the upgraded Nintendo Switch Online membership next week.
Looking forward to it.
Well, you'll get access to it too. Family plan member.
I don't really use it to play the older games.
Me either, but Clickbait Boyfriend's sure excited for Wind Waker. Jorah's Mask.
Good. Alright, do you want to sign us off?
Yeah, I guess so. Listeners, I hope that this week you don't need a tutorial to eat some good Turkey Day food.